Hello, everyone, and welcome to EthicsTalk Live. We are so happy to host the EthicsTalk Live session on the Global Anti-Corruption Day, and this is actually already the third time we are doing the EthicsTalk Live on anti-corruption. And of course, one of the reasons behind is that anti-corruption is one key element of a ethics and compliance program. And we also know that the corruption is a major obstacle to sustainable development. And where we want to focus is to remember that the reasoning for an anti-corruption program is not just to avoid the legal consequences, but to remember that this is a topic that has a huge impact on the lives of people and on the human rights. But Anna, would you like to share a bit why we are doing the Ethics Talk today and with whom?
Yes, thanks Nina for the introduction, and hello everybody also from my side. I can't say how excited I am about this talk. So we will have a full hour where we will dive into corruption, and I am very excited about our guests. I will introduce them in just a second, but I'm also so excited about our corruption report, Focus on Corruption. So Nina will share a bit about that, but we have, as part of our Nordic Business Ethics Survey, we have asked some corruption-specific questions that we did not include in the report we launched a couple of weeks ago. But now, today, we have that special edition and some very, very interesting findings from the Nordic countries. But with us here today, we have two champions. So we have Sara Koski from DLA Piper and Sam Eastwood from Mayor Brown. And Sara, she has an extensive experience from working at DLA Piper's compliance and internal investigations and white-collar defense practice. And she's based in Paris and calling in from Paris today. So Sara, we are so privileged to have you here with us today.
And Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yes, great. Then we also have with us Sam, and I have to say there are a couple of persons who I have been incremental from my understanding of ethics and compliance and corruption. And many of you know I love to use the duck test. You know, if it looks looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck when it comes to analyzing red flags. And that is a test I learned from Sam Eastwood. So Sam is really, one of the most important persons for me that has taught me a lot about compliance. So Sam, I am very, very honored to have you with us here today.
Yeah, well, very pleased to be here, and I had forgotten the duck test, but I remember it well now.
Yeah,
I will take note of that as well.
Yeah, you should. It's really a great one when management is asking you for the smoking gun. You just bring forth the duck test instead. But with that, I think we should also of course be thanking not only DLA Piper but also my speaker who is enabling this talk and making sure everything runs smoothly in the studio. And as you can see, we are doing this fully virtual and trying how this works out. But with that, Nina, any practicalities that I forgot? And then would you please take us into the anti-corruption or to the corruption report?
Happy to do so. And here, well, I think it's we have a huge pleasure to introduce the second Focus on Corruption report. So as Anna mentioned, while we have been gathering the data for the Nordic Business Ethics Survey, we've added a few corruption-related questions. And we released the first report last year, and now this is the second time. And I think as we speak, you are able to download the report from our website. So you may do so while you are listening to the Ethics Talk, and feel free to add any questions or comments to the chat. And we have now the opportunity to also discuss this with our amazing partners. But with this Focus on Corruption report, we have asked 4 types of questions. The first one is actually the same question we asked in the Nordic Business Ethics survey, which was regarding the observations of giving, asking for, or receiving bribes. Then we are going to dig deeper on what type of different forms of corruptions people have observed. And then the important question, is it unethical? And then lastly, we have given some euro values for the respondents to evaluate what counts as a bribe. Just to remind where is this data coming from? This is actually one of the questions we've received a lot since we published the Nordic Business Ethics report. So we have altogether 4,000 responses from the Nordic countries plus 1,000 response from Estonia. And we have gathered this data via online panel methodology in June 2020, and we've used Feedback as our data collection service provider to collect the data from these countries. But yes, let's go into the report and look at the numbers, and afterwards we will then have interesting discussions from these numbers with our guests. We, as part of the NBE survey, we launched this number 39. So 39% of the respondents had observed giving, asking for, or receiving bribes during the past 12 months. And when we look at the figures from the country perspective, you can see that the Sweden has the highest number with 50%. And me and Anna, we got questions after the launch event that, you know, do you have some kind of a mistake because the number is so high? So this will definitely be one topic we're going to discuss today, that what are these numbers and how do how can we have this high percentage here? And we've also addressed this, these figures by sector, by age, gender, working years, and by role. And with a quick look, you can see that actually the public listed companies have observed most often bribery. And also when comparing the age, you can see a huge difference between the younger generations and older. Also, females tend to observe almost twice as often as males. And then it seems that when you've been from 3 to 10 years in working lives, you are most likely to make these observations. Interestingly, also the top management and line managers are more often observing than the rest of the organization. But of course, we may all have a very different perceptions on what counts as a bribe. So to dig into the details, we wanted to ask that, okay, what types of different behaviors you may have observed? And the list that you can see here, it's coming directly from the Swedish Anti-Corruption Institute's publication called Code to Prevent Corruption in Business. So these are the type of benefits that could be improper in nature and could be deemed to influence behavior. And interestingly, you can see Sweden here popping up in all of these various categories. But then is it unethical? When looking at the same categories as in the previous questions, it seems that more or less half of the respondents thinks that these type of behaviors are unethical. And our last question was regarding what counts as a bribe. And here, I think, interestingly, when we looked at the first question, the publicly listed companies were the ones observing most often bribery, but they are least likely to consider that any gift is a bribe. I think I found this one an interesting result. Also, when looking at the countries, Denmark seems to be more keen on thinking that any gift is a bribe. And lastly, we split the same figures also by age and gender. And here, once again, even though the younger generation were more likely to observe bribery, they are least likely to consider that any gift is a bribe. So this is, in a nutshell, our report, and you can all find it from our website. And I think next, let's discuss these findings with our guests.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nina, for a very interesting overview. And I felt I could have dived in, like, you know, almost after every sentence you said to give a comment or discuss. I feel there is so much data and rich data there that we don't, we are barely scratching the surface on. But hey, let's start the discussion. And we have to start, Sam and Sarah, with the obvious question here, because the survey suggests that 39% of the respondents in this survey have observed giving, asking, or receiving bribes during the last 12 months. So 39%. What is your take on this? Sam, do you mind starting?
Yeah, so I've got a number of reflections. I think it's certainly eye-catching. 39% seems like a big figure. It'll generate discussion and reflection, and that's absolutely right. So well done, both of you. I think it reflects a growing awareness within the Nordics, and that's true beyond the Nordics as well. Personally, I don't think there is significantly more corruption than there was yesterday, although surveys say that people think that is the case. But again, that may be a reflection of awareness. And the awareness comes from a number of quarters. I think companies have a role. Ultimately, the education programs now being rolled out are much more impressive than they used to be. I think there's a vigorous press who are really focused on this area. I think there is a pretty healthy NGO sector who are highlighting these issues through surveys and otherwise. And then there are scandals. And the reality is you've had your fair share of scandals. You might say even more than your fair share of scandals, but that does sort of feed into the awareness. I think you really, in the end, the survey needs to be repeated. So what I suppose I'd be interested in, and you might have views on, is what last year's survey said and the year before that, and then what we're going to look at next year. But what would be really useful is to have a rich seam of surveys over a period of time, and then one can look at patterns. And that's true just as much within sort of company surveys as these sorts of surveys. Finally, and you might wonder when I'm going to stop, I think it's really important to look at this in context. I mean, I do think that the Nordics are generally benign before you sort of do yourselves too badly. If you look at the CPI index, the Nordics do pretty well. If you look at the Global Corruption Barometer, which is done by Transparency International, which is a bit of a plug for TI, that reveals a pretty rich picture. But the headline is consistent with what you've got, which is they surveyed 40,000 people across the EU, and 62% of those people thought that corruption was a big problem in their country. If you then look more granularly and you compare the Nordics with other countries, again, I think you do reasonably well in comparison. So I don't think this is a Nordic problem. I think it's reflective of a bigger issue, but certainly, and I think the Nordics is a broadly benign environment. The real challenge is when Nordic companies operate overseas, and then it's a wild and somewhat different place.
Yeah, very, very interesting, and totally share, Sam, your views. Maybe just allow me to take a moment just to congratulate you on this newest edition of the survey. Having this type of a survey, very wide survey, we have 5,000 respondents now over 5 countries. This is something that didn't exist before and doesn't exist in most of the different European regions. I think there's an immense value of having this type of this is a first level glance at the perception of bribery, and not only perception of bribery, but what situations people have faced. So what can be said compared to the previous ones? I think the wording was a little bit different earlier, I think in 2019 or 2020, but I comparing those, it's clear, however, that the numbers are on the rise, not among all the age groups, but still I think there is a clear change in the perception of whether there has been corrupt conduct in the past 12 months or not, and more respondents are replying that there has been that type of conduct. So I think that's significant. So where does that come from? And as Sam mentioned just earlier, maybe that's finally the awareness of those risks that starts to show. And this is also why it's so important to having this type of studies and surveys, because this is also the awareness raising part of the issue. But as you all know, most of the international surveys, there's one point that has come again and again and again, is that Nordic countries should concentrate on awareness raising and understanding that those risks are real. And now we have this type of wake-up calls, like the scandals and this type of surveys that make us realize that maybe, just maybe, this is a bit of a bigger problem than we thought it would be. And maybe also, and we don't know, we'll discuss in just a moment, is it also the fact that there are more risks right now? I don't know, I don't have the answer, both, but there can be multiple factors, but extremely interesting survey. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for so brilliant insights from your side. And I think one thing that I would also like to sort of, we drill deeper into these responses. I mean, Nina showed these scenarios that we have taken out from the Swedish Anti-Corruption Institute's, guidance on what could constitute a bribe, and then we asked, okay, have you seen this? And then, do you consider it unethical? And we saw that many, actually half, did not really say, yeah, these behaviors are unethical. And I think this is, the sort of where I'm going is more towards these small favors, the slippery slope, where we may think this is not really bribery. Yeah, what happened to Telia and Ericsson, that is clearly bribery. But I don't know, Sam, what do you think then when we have this 39%? Do you think it's these big Telia Ericsson cases that people have seen, or maybe even these smaller ones?
So it's going to be a range, and obviously there is a difference between something being unethical and something being a bribe. And a bribe is illegal, whereas something can be unethical but perfectly legal. So I would counter. I don't think any gift is a bribe. For instance, I think it's entirely legitimate to have gifts even in the business environment, but there is a lot of grey in terms of circumstance and context. I mean, I would focus in terms of scenarios. I think I would focus on personal connections to secure access to public benefits in the world of schools or medical treatment. I think that's interesting. In the UK, there's a growing scandal around procurement of PPE equipment, so that's quite sort of relevant and topical. But ultimately, COVID generated a huge amount of public expenditure, and the question now, with the benefit of hindsight, is where did all that money go, and was that properly spent, and was there improper influence? And I think there are some real questions. The justification, of course, certainly by the UK government, is we were in a dreadful hurry and we needed to do this fast. Now that's interesting, because companies will often have the same reflex, but that's not an excuse for not conducting basic due diligence and precautionary steps. I think the other issue in the UK and doubtless in the Nordics as well is access to political influence. And there's been quite a lot of soul searching around the extent of Russian influence in British politics, for instance. Again, it's all blindingly clear now, but what was going on in the last 5 years? And I think people, and this is about people, your survey is about 4,000 people, people are really quite sensitive to these issues.
And it's interesting, Sam, you bring up this PPE scandal, because I mean that was very, very real in Finland as well. We had this emergency central or whatever you call it, and a huge scandal how they were buying PPE equipment and so on. So that's a very real one. Do you, Sarah, have any reflections on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, regarding the slippery slope that you just described, I'm working extensively on global policies to prevent bribery and ethical risks. And each and every time the clients ask, so how much? What is the value? What can we set as a threshold? Who needs to control? And when you look at the different legislation, and the same goes for the Nordic legislation, is that there is no single euro amount there saying you can't go beyond this amount, otherwise it's going to be bribery. What the legislation says is do not bribe. You're going to be punished if you do bribe. And then we're there discussing in what situation, in the context, how do you take that into account? Can there be any benefits to public officials? And very frankly, right now, at least in France, my own recommendation is no leisure, no gifts to public officials, because it's just too heavily regulated, it's just too risky, and there are more and more at-risk scenarios in that area. It's easier to move away from that. I know that many wouldn't maybe agree, but typically leisure activities, sports, golf, I don't know, hotel voyage, travel for the spouse, and so on and so forth. That existed. I hope it no longer exists. And if I can prevent that from happening, I'll do that. That's for the slippery slope parts. And for the bigger scenarios, yes, Sam, I fully agree. What I observe are scenarios that are quite difficult to detect sometimes. They would be very elaborate schemes, fake invoices that you couldn't always detect, using middlemen, intermediaries without no qualification, no experience whatsoever, except the possibility to open the doors. Those scenarios would facilitate or lead to corruption in many situations, but would not be the situation where a bribe would be directly paid to someone in the form of, cash, flowers, chocolate, or anything like that.
Exactly. I think there is now a lot of good remarks made on the fact that it's all gray and there is no exact limits, and it's a very like a personal thing as well, because there is the personal benefit aspect. So next, let's talk a little bit about this age dimension, because it's quite dramatic, the change, how likely the younger generations are to observe bribe compared to the older generations. So is there behind some kind of an ethical blindness, because the longer you are in a certain context, the more likely you are also to be part of the problem, and that way also unable to recognize the limit where in terms of what is okay and what is not, or is it just something else? What thoughts you have on this aspect? Sarah, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting topic. It's a huge difference between ages that we are seeing here. I don't think there's any recent or frequent or comprehensive studies over this. I think this is one of the first I've seen where we have this type of a very, very clear difference of focus on the age. Maybe it would be interesting to further be able to dive in the numbers of details of numbers of respondents by age category to further analyze whether those are the age groups and the experience in work are fully matched, and go a little bit further in the analysis. But generally speaking, I think, and this is, by the way, was something that we discussed with Sam yesterday when we got together to discuss today's session. It's very true that younger generations are, generally speaking, recognized or often recognized as being a bit more aware of ethical issues, societal issues, CSR issues, human rights, protection of environment. And fight against corruption, of course, is linked to these questions. Corruption is recognized as pervasive for the economy as a whole. and has serious economic and social impacts, of course. It's linked to poverty, reducing democratic processes, and so on. So maybe there's a link to this, but maybe there's also a generational gap, a change that has taken place. Younger people are more likely to understand and identify these risks. They studied them maybe at school, maybe also due to their functions, they meet the more frequent petty corruption. And when I say petty, I don't mean it's not significant, it's always significant. But maybe they would be encountered with that type of small ethical issues more often, whereas I would expect that more senior managers would maybe be more aware of those bigger issues that are hopefully more rare. I don't want to be too long to let you, Sam, comment also on this.
Excellent reflections. And when we look at our NBE survey, it's very interesting that no matter what is the unethical behavior, but always the younger generations are more likely to observe. So definitely there must be something that their perception and expectations are different. Sami, any thoughts on this age view?
Look, I think Sara's covered the ground. I mean, certainly it is my experience that the younger generation, and that certainly includes law firms like Mayer Brown, are much more societally aware than their elders. That's me, and we just need to listen to them. So no, I agree. I mean, look, there may be an element of naivety, and let's play it out. And it may be that as you get older, you get more and more conditioned by reality. But I hope that I think we've all got lots to learn from that. So no, I would say, certainly it starts with the environmentally conscious factor, but that plays into linked elements like corruption, and the links between corruption and environmental damage are well documented. So I agree with Sara.
So, but let's go back then to another question that we have touched a little bit upon already, is that we have had our fair share of scandals here in the Nordics. It's like we have the FCPA top 10 list and two big Swedish corporations that are sort of boasting on that list. And the big question is then, when we have transparent societies, we do have free media. I don't have to bribe the police if they stop me for speeding. Well, I don't speed, but if I would speed, right? Or when I get my passport, I don't have to bribe to get my passport, or to get kids into school. You don't have to bribe. So we don't have that sort of day-to-day corruption, but still companies end up in big trouble. And the million-dollar question is then, like, why is this? I don't know who feels prone to start. Sara, would you mind starting?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I do believe that those scandals have been quite a big shock in the Nordic countries. Myself, I've been based in Paris for many years now, but I'm originally from Finland, and so still feeling the somehow the growing in Finland what the great trusts in the integrity of Nordic society I had, and I by the way still do very much believe in that. So it's been a shock for the Nordic countries, I believe, to see those sometimes and most of the time very well reputed companies that have ended up in this type of scandals. I would say it has, however, been an extremely good wake-up call for us all. It allows us to realize that even in societies where integrity and trust play a significant role, as it is the case in the Nordics, corrupt conduct may take place and does take place when we go to global markets. It is not to say that in Nordics corruption would not exist. It certainly does. I'm sure it does. But when we do go out to those global markets, of course, we're just in the very, very same playing field as everyone else. Just to be sure that I'm replying to the question, I believe that detecting corruption and admitting corruption risk exists is extremely hard. When we do work on like global risk maps, for instance, I discuss with the business persons, most of the time they are first unable to identify their risks, even for companies that have very mature systems. And when they do, there would be great tendency in under evaluating the risk levels or the likelihood of those risks taking place. So one must, of course, understand where we're playing. We wouldn't be riding bike in the same way in Helsinki, in Oslo, in Naples, in Brazil, in Peking. I don't know. So the same goes for the risk management approach and understanding the risks. You just can't have the same processes in place in all of the different countries. But the question was, and Sam, just jump in if you want to comment. The question was whether there is something specific to Nordic companies that would, expose us and make us more vulnerable than the others. And I don't think that there is anything that would make the Nordic companies more exposed than the others when they go abroad. Legislation is quite mature. We have those values of integrity and trust, but quite interestingly now thinking about it, there are lots of some international evaluations say that specific trust in integrity and in people might make us a little bit more exposed to those risks than the others, compared to systems that are more rule and control based. When we do trust in a people and in the natural integrity, that might just not be enough in countries that have higher risk rates. Sam, I'm going to turn the word to you. I don't want to be too long, monopolize the discussion.
But it's great. I want to complement the question just a bit, Sam, before you answer. I think, Sarah, what you're saying, that there is some kind of ethical blindness perhaps going on as well. And Sam, happy to really hear your insights on why do you think we've had these big scandals? And then my add-on question is this the tip of the iceberg?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think, the answer is I can think of very few countries with companies with international operations who have not had problems, and that certainly includes the UK. I think the distinguishing features about the Nordics, if one can generalize, and it's pretty invidious to have to do so, is that you do have a benign environment. Whatever your survey might say, the reality is the CPI index consistently calls it out. You have a benign environment at home, and that might present problems when you're trying to address the international environment, which can be very different. So I think that's one feature. The other one is, the reality is that your legislation is not as hard-hitting as in some countries, and your enforcement is not as strong as the OECD would like it. And the result is that the dynamics which operate in a boardroom level, even if the company is subject to the FCPA or the Bribery Act, aren't as frightening, and fear does play a part, or is an important dynamic, as in some other countries. The reality is the new legislation in France and the auditing by the AFA of companies has made a significant difference. And the Bribery Act, notwithstanding the UK's apparent failure to properly prosecute, but the Bribery Act has driven behaviour. So I think lack of enforcement is probably a factor. Otherwise, taking a step back, and here I suppose I speak for companies from any jurisdiction, but my personal observation are decentralized businesses is potentially problematic, certainly in terms of sort of compliance. So buy a business, if you don't conduct proper post-acquisition integration, if you don't monitor them, then you've got problems. So historically, you'd buy a business, you'd see it as a part of your portfolio, it would effectively generate dividend, but you left it alone. And maybe that's a Nordic characteristic. I hesitate before I say that, but ultimately you don't interfere, you don't impose your rules and your processes or even your people on the organization. I think that's difficult. I really like rotation of staff. So the challenge again there is, if you have got operations in a whole range of different organizations, is make sure that there is a rotation of people, so people come in with new vision and visibility. I really like strong legal teams. I don't know if one can generalize, but I think that a culture where the legal department is fairly strong and well resourced and working in hand with the compliance function is super important. Strong management playing against weak lawyers is always a problem.
Super. Do I still have a time to comment on something you mentioned there? I mean, you mentioned, Sam, the CPI index, and that's maybe something that works together with the ethical blindness that you mentioned previously, Anna, because CPI index gives us maybe the wrong calmness about saying, okay, all the Nordic companies, Scandinavian countries, are within the top 5, or Estonia, I think it's top 12 or top 13 this year. But just it's important to remember that the CPI index is, of course, based on perception. Even though it comes from reputable sources and experts and business people who reply, it only covers corruption in public sector. It does not cover certain relevant risk areas. For instance, I don't think it covers foreign bribery. So, I mean, if we too much overtly trust to that CPI index, we're maybe not prepared when going abroad. And you ask also the question about the tip of the iceberg. I don't know. I hope not. But what is clear I think in the Nordic business scene is that there are lots of companies and big groups in high risk sectors. I mean, I don't want to say that there is a very specific list, defined list of what is at risk, but oftentimes you hear, of course, all the big public sector contracts, defense. You would have health sector, of course. You could have telecommunications, financial sector. Those are also the Nordic companies in those sectors that have ended up in difficulties in recent years, and that is a big part of companies in Nordic countries having those global activities, and so being in high risk markets within those sectors can be something that still increases the risk level for them.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and I think also you brought up something, Sam, about the decentralized operations and also non-integration and strong legal teams and so on. And I have worked, both in-house and then I worked as a consultant, interacted with a lot of Nordic companies. And I do think we may have a trait where we are very lean from a head office perspective. And that's just because of how many Nordic companies have grown, and we have usually acquired other companies or then established overseas operations through intermediaries, because we are not big. I mean, because the whole market has been so small, so it doesn't make sense to have a huge head office. And then when we sort of conquer the world, we don't beef up the head office, but many Nordic companies, they feel pride in this very lean head office, and we don't have this immense overhead. And there is not this realization that you need to have that backbone to support the organization. So I think there is a bit of a structural issue, not in all Nordic companies, but I think in many Nordic companies, I would argue.
Yeah, I recognize that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's sure. And you now both brought up the difference between somehow centralized and decentralized systems. I don't know if I mean, it could seem like very logical and natural that the centralized would always be preferable, but I mean, decentralized can also have its advantages and inconveniences from the risk management standpoints. Of course, decentralized, where you don't control anything and you haven't done proper pre-acquisition due diligence and you haven't done the post-closing integration, compliance integration. Of course, that's a high risk because you don't know what's happening in your company, basically, when you say that. But I mean, even in a centralized organization, there can be issues because the central team could be a little bit far away from what's happening in the further subsidiaries abroad, or the central team would be weaker in a way that if there's no effective controls over its own activities or over the top decision maker, that there could be weak points as well. So both of the systems have advantages and disadvantages from that point. What I feel is extremely important is to have strong legal team and control environments, and that's the role of the top management to make sure. Top management's role's active involvement is key for effective risk prevention, and one of the key aspects in that big mission is making sure that there is an adequate staff to control and monitor the program. Not only existence of the program, but controlling it and making sure there's an escalation of issues, whatever the company structure is.
Exactly. Yeah, and this is we shouldn't talk too much about compliance programs per se, but I would like to challenge that a bit, because there are two repeat offenders that are pretty fresh out from the enforcement machine. So we have Oracle and we have ABB, and I think ABB, it's like their third FCPA violation. I think for Oracle it's maybe the second one, and I think it of course exemplifies one thing, that no organization is immune and you cannot root out corruption and corrupt behavior. But I think especially for me, because I've been studying the Oracle enforcement action in particular, and I mean, they lay out sort of their compliance program and checks and balances and approval mechanisms and so on. And the companies I have seen, in the Nordics, the program that Oracle has was very advanced, but it still failed because of the behaviors and the people. So I think that is also where we sometimes may rely too much on the formal structures, and we don't realize what kind of a culture we really have in the organization. And I thought there was also a brilliant article, I think it was on the FCPA blog, sorry if I can't quote who had written that, but there was a really good and insightful article on DD and due diligence, and outlined Wirecard and Theranos on what, and then there was this Bitcoin scandal as well. Like there were, what kind of DD was done previously here, because apparently there were reputable investors and so on involved. So I'm wondering also, about form over substance, and that's a real risk in this regard. More a commentary from my side.
I mean, absolutely agreed. I mean, the compliance policy that would be pages and pages and pages and too hard to understand or not supervised properly would be just a piece of paper. I believe that the controls are the key and the monitoring is the key. Now, I mean, I'm not, without going into this specific case, I mean, even the best program can fail, even when there are the best monitoring and controls in place. And what sometimes is interesting is that the compliance program and the controls allow detecting that wrongdoing, and allow for the company to go and see the authorities in the countries where that's an option and a possibility to negotiate and show just how strong their prevention mechanisms are, and maybe from that side also be able to negotiate a preferable deal for them overall. I don't know, Sam, if you want to add something onto that.
No, I think you've covered it. I mean, look, Anna, I'm with you in terms of the balance. I mean, there have to be rules and there have to be controls, but in the end, it's people, and that's really difficult. That's super intangible. I mean, one of the things that I've done is I have been an independent monitor, so I have worked and reported to the Serious Fraud Office and the development banks, and the question that they asked me to report on is culture. How do you report on culture? And the answer is, you know it when you see it, but you probably start with senior management and you identify whether they actually understand what it is that compliance are doing and what they're worried about. But I think I mean, so I think the importance of that is vastly underestimated, and I don't know whether we're going to talk about whistleblowing, but really the open culture that underpins whistleblowing, the speak up culture, encouraging people to talk about the little bribes or the unethical conduct. I mean, in the end, a company wants to identify small dripping taps at an early stage, rather than being confronted with real floods at a later stage. So, yeah, nothing more to add.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and I think that now that the companies are implementing the whistleblowing directive, it has quite huge impact on how you implement it, whether it's just for the purpose of being compliant or for the purpose of really creating the speak up culture for the smaller issues as well. what are your thoughts on the future? What kind of future we will see once we have the whistleblowing systems implemented in wider scale of organizations?
I've got a. I mean, I think the UK's financial services regime has a particular rule which I think may become more common, which is that, I mean, in the UK there has to be a dedicated individual at board level who is responsible for the programme, not the policy, the programme. And actually allocation of responsibility is really important. But if you've got someone at board level who is responsible for the speak up culture, that represents, I think, a really powerful force. So I would say, I mean, in the end, I think what will happen is there'll be more transparency around companies' whistleblowing programs, which in turn will generate better programs, which will generate more issues coming to the fore, which is not a problem. It's a good thing. And then one learns from issues which are identified, hopefully at an early stage, remediated, and then form the basis for the ongoing program. I think there's lots around whistleblowing. Whether we call it whistleblowing or not, we could have another discussion.
Yeah, but this is also a good bridge, I think, to the next topic. If we think that, you know, generally, if we look at the corporate social responsibility reports and there are the figures, we don't see that much of an observed corruption incidents. But then on the other hand, if we look at the Nordic Business Ethics Survey, where we have, for example, 67% of respondents observing favoritism and 52% observing stealing from work, and then we have this 39% of the observed bribery. So definitely there is an interesting aspect here. So what's happening here? What do you think?
Sarah, why don't you kick off?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, it's so difficult. This would be a 1-hour topic all alone. But
We'll
it's
give you 5
like
minutes.
good. I mean, there are so many issues. So firstly, what the people observe might not, what they perceive as being unethical, might not be illegal, might not be bribe. First aspect. Other aspect, what comes up to the knowledge from the ground, from the bottom to up, the knowledge of the legal teams and compliance team, and then finally ends up its way until the management and maybe in a report. That's a totally different story as well. So I think there's a very little portion that goes up there. And the issues that end up being investigated sometimes, unfortunately, it happens that at the end of an investigation, you still don't know, or you need additional investigation. And declaring an issue that has not been properly investigated, or the next steps regarding, for instance, do we want to cooperate with the authorities? Do we want to go and disclose this? Have not yet been assessed thoroughly. I wouldn't find it surprising at all that some issues just wouldn't end up in being reported. Because you need to completely understand and manage the circle of, if you do disclose, what are the next steps in the company strategy in dealing with that issue. Sometimes you can deal with some issues internally totally and make them mitigate them adequately. Sam, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I mean, there is a disconnect. There are lots of reasons for it. I think I would project that there will be more issues bubbling up to the company, and that's a function of awareness. It's a function of good whistleblowing programs. It's a function of good compliance programs. I think there will be more transparency because stakeholders will demand it, the legislation will require it, and some companies are already doing it. I think that represents a challenge, but it's one that companies are beginning to master, and that's right. I mean, back to my sort of monitorship experience, I mean, the question that, the first question is, tell me the amount of ethical breaches there have been, and the right answer is not none, nor is it too many to mention. It's somewhere in between. And then one has a conversation around what those issues are and why it happened and whether you've learned. So Nina, you're right to raise the issue. 39% doesn't square with sort of observed corporate disclosures. There are lots of complicated reasons, but I think things are going to change. So let's see.
Yeah, and Sam, reacting to what you just said about the whistleblowing, I think the EU directive and its implementation in countries, in all the EU member countries, will tremendously change things. We've in France had whistleblowing protective regime, very comparable to what was now introduced within the EU already since 2017, I think June, and there has been a significant rise in the investigative work and in how we handle, how we protect whistleblowers, and that's really key. And still today, when I discuss with clients, that there are too often situations where they say we don't have any reports per year, and that just sounds to me like, okay, so someone is worried. And when we look at public reports, we hear that the whistleblowers still are worried they would not be protected enough. So again, that tone at the top, again, that corporate culture, that speak up culture, Sam, that you mentioned earlier, that openness and protection that there will be for the whistleblowers is essential for them to step up. And handling those reports properly is absolutely in the interest of the company.
Yeah, and I think there we can clearly see how regulation is driving corporate behavior. Yeah. And we have one observation actually from this when we look at Norway, for example. Mm-hmm. So ever since the start in 2019, we can see that Norway somehow is behaving better, and employees are more comfortable. And also we have done one targeted survey on compliance programs, and we see Norwegian companies are more mature. And then when we look at the OECD and how they comment upon Norway and, for example, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, there is a big difference. And I think, after Statoil and then with Yara, I think the Økokrim has also, their resources and how they deal with these matters. It makes a difference. Mm-hmm. So I do think that we need better regulation, and we can see that in Norway there clearly makes a difference. I think we can probably see that somewhat in the UK and France as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it would be really interesting to hear from both of you where you think the regulation will go or should go in the Nordics.
Mm-hmm. Sam, do you want to start?
Sarah,
I can if you
Sarah, I saw you were really keen to start, so
Yeah, Sarah, that's yours.
Oh, it's mine. Okay, no. I was trying to give the floor to Sam, but okay, I will. I don't know. Interestingly, just before we started the session, or in fact already yesterday, I gave a call to one of my colleagues in Norway and said, "Look, tell me what's different in Norway." And he said, hear me, it's just very simple. They have focused more on enforcement. And I believe that's true, but enforcement is hard because it means resources. It's very expensive. It's hard. So where should the legislation go? Listen, I think we're already going there. More legislation because just for the story, the history in France for this Sapin 2 law, we have a Sapin 2 law which made mandatory for certain bigger companies to adopt a very, very, very wide compliance program. At the same time, they created this agency to control those programs. At the same time, they created a out-of-court settlement for criminal charges, French equivalent of DPA. Just a couple of years before, they had created an authority, specific prosecutor's office to prosecute complex financial crime, including complex bribery. Why all this happened? Well, there's of course not one reason, but one of the reasons was that French companies ended up continuously in the FCPA top 10 list. And clearly there was some type of a frustration that hundreds of millions of euros were being paid by local companies to foreign authorities. And now we're observing exactly the same thing with these scandals. Some of them are very, very significant in amounts. And part of that money also goes out. I think combining whistleblowing, CSR revolution, the growing awareness, the pressure from the international organizations, these scandals together, I don't see any other route then towards more regulation, that will, as in France, push for a very rapid change in the landscape.
But Sam, do you think this will happen? I know you have had have very good insights into this area in the Nordic countries. Do you think it's
okay? So my projection is that you will have more regulation in the Nordics, no question, and because if you don't enforce against your companies and your individuals, then the Americans will, and the English will possibly, and the French might. I have to say, I'm a great believer in investment as well as regulation. I mean, the regulations in the UK are okay. I mean, they're really not bad at all. The issue is we don't have investment, and we don't have, with that comes sort of people who are skilled and ambitious and maybe capable even. So you need the money, and right now we don't have very much money in this sort of post-COVID Ukraine crisis, post-Brexit world. But it does require investment. It's not a great vote winner, but long term it's super important.
Yeah, so I guess it's we're bracing up for increased regulation then for Nordic companies. I think that's very much needed. I do think it has a deterrent effect, and also that's because to be fair, nowadays regulation matters, but Nordic companies are more looking to the FCPA or UK bribery act or SAP and do. It's not the local regulation, and I think that is a shame. I think if we want to stay on top of the TI indexes and so on, I think we should lead by example here as well. I've heard some just anecdotal evidence from Finland that there is even a reluctance to regulate too harshly locally because we don't want to hurt our companies, like fragile Finnish international companies that are competing abroad. We don't want to cause this disruption for these companies, and that's been said on a quite high political level. So I think there is a stigma around corruption. For some reason, it's perhaps more easy to regulate around environment and human rights, but corruption, it sort of really speaks to the human nature and that to think somebody is corrupt, it's hard. But I think our evidence clearly shows that there is a lot that is perceived as corruption in our Nordic countries, and we definitely need to step up. But with that, Nina, any final question from your side, or then we'll just have the final remarks from our brilliant guests here?
Yes, I think it's been a very insightful discussion. I have millions of questions here, but I'm conscious that we have 2 minutes time left, and I think it's been a very good viewpoints. And I don't know. Let's check if we have any good questions from the chat. At least I can't see here any final questions. So maybe it's time to thank our amazing guests.
Yeah. So Sarah, Sam, your final tips to Nordic ethics and compliance officers who are watching here today and just want to take the corruption work in their or anti-corruption work to the next level. A quick sort of best tip from your side, Sarah, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Me again. No, I don't know. Be aware where you're working. What is your activity, where you are working? Know your risks. I think that's the starting point, the most important. Don't leave those rocks unturned. Look underneath them. Don't close the eyes.
Great, Sarah. And Sam, so you have the honor of sort of concluding your brilliant tips for all of us.
Well, I mean, focusing on the survey, I would say certainly the compliance community, you've got a discussion point. This is a discussion point. And in terms of you and your work, I'd say keep the debate going and let's talk about next year. But I do think a bit of, building on this survey, I think would be helpful. I think seeing the survey in context is important. But look, there's a discussion point and it's good to talk about these things.
Brilliant. And that's just what we have done here. So thank you, everybody who joined us live, and thank you, everybody who's watching the recording afterwards. This was a true pleasure and very inspirational and insightful for me. So thank you Sam, Sarah, and thank you, Nina.
Thank you so much. A pleasure, a huge pleasure.